I knew something was wrong the moment the sleeper opened its eyes before the lights even came on, staring at me with a focus no sedated subject should ever have. Down here in an underwater lab where the walls hum like a living throat, we survived by following 11 strange rules that were handed to me on my first night. Rules I didn't understand until it was too late. I remember the first time I broke one of the rules. The way the alarm stayed silent even though everything else began to move. Some days I still ask myself if that thing truly woke up on its own, or if it was waiting for me to slip. The moment I stepped into the sleeping wing that night, I remembered Rule 1: never approach a subject if its eyes open before the lights do, a line I used to laugh at during training. The hall felt unusually cold, the kind of cold that crawled through my sleeves instead of settling on the skin. As I walked past the stasis pods, the soft hum of the machinery felt almost like breathing, slow and rhythmic. I kept telling myself everything was fine, but something about the way the pod lights dimmed made my stomach twist. The silence felt too intentional, as if someone had lowered the volume of the world just for me. I checked the monitor logs like I always did, scanning for abnormalities I hoped not to find. Most subjects were showing stable readings, though the heart rate graphs flickered in ways I couldn't fully explain. I leaned closer to one screen, tapping in a fresh timestamp while thinking about how often the systems glitch down here. My coworker Lena used to say the ocean pressed on the electronics the same way it pressed on us, slowly reshaping us without permission. I could almost hear her voice teasing me for letting nerves get to me. I wished she were here now. Pod 7 was the first one that made me pause. The biometric display showed rapid motion inside, despite the sedation level being high enough to subdue an entire room. I frowned and adjusted the brightness, hoping it was just interference, but the movement didn't stop. Something inside the pod shifted again, the screen blurring for a moment, as though struggling to keep up. I swallowed, forcing myself to breathe slow and steady. I had seen subjects twitch before, but this felt different, too controlled, too deliberate. I leaned closer to Pod 7, keeping enough distance in case I had misread the rule. "If you can hear me," I whispered, "you're supposed to be under." Of course, subjects never heard anything in sedation. That was the point of these experiments. The sleep cycle kept them suspended halfway between consciousness and nothingness, where their memories could be studied like threads in water. But the figure inside shifted again, pressing lightly against the curved glass in a way that felt almost curious. My breath tightened as a strange wave of recognition washed through me. Then the pod lights flickered, once, then twice, like a shutter blinking in slow motion. I didn't move. I wanted to turn around and leave, but my feet felt anchored to the floor. I knew the emergency lights would come on next, but they stayed off, leaving me in that dim half-glow that made everything look softer and more dangerous. When the stasis monitors rebooted, the screen for Pod 7 brightened enough for me to see the silhouette inside rising slowly. Not struggling, rising. I felt a cold pulse of dread run from the base of my spine all the way to my throat. The eyes opened before the ceiling lights came on. That was how I knew I wasn't imagining it. Two pale circles staring directly at me through the glass, unblinking, steady, and aware. They focused on me with the stillness of someone who had been waiting long before I arrived. My body reacted first a step back, a shake in my fingers, a tightening in my chest that made breathing feel optional. I wanted to call for backup, but I knew my voice wouldn't come out right now. I wasn't even sure anyone would answer at this hour. I remembered Lena telling me once that subjects sometimes twitched as they drifted through memory cycles, but none of them ever opened their eyes. That was supposed to be impossible. Their bodies were chemically locked in a state where even blinking required more brain activity than they were allowed to have. But the subject in Pod 7 stared like it understood something about me. I didn't understand about myself. Its lips didn't move, yet I felt an unmistakable sensation that I was being communicated with, not in words, but in a kind of internal pressure. I forced myself to look away, trying to convince myself that panic was coloring everything wrong. Maybe I was misreading the angle of its face, or maybe the sedation mixture had settled unevenly. But when I looked back, the eyes were still open, locked on mine with unwavering intent. I backed away farther, pressing my palm against the cold metal railing to steady myself. My mind kept repeating the rule, like a warning whispered from somewhere deep inside my memory. I had never understood why they worded it so specifically, but now the phrasing felt painfully precise. I debated leaving the room entirely, but something in me refused to turn my back on the pod. Instead, I reached for the intercom panel on the wall, hoping the static wasn't too heavy tonight. The panel crackled softly when I pressed the button, though I couldn't tell if anyone on the other side could hear me. "This is Research Unit 3, I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Pod 7 is showing unauthorized activity, requesting backup." There was no response, just the soft hum of the pod and the steady breathing that didn't belong to me. When I looked back at the pod window, the subject had moved closer, standing upright in a way that seemed almost graceful. The fluid inside the chamber rippled as if responding to its presence rather than its motion. Its eyes remained open, bright and fixated, as though it were studying me with clinical interest. I felt myself stepping backward until my shoulders brushed the wall, the cold metal sending a shiver through me. I whispered a quiet plea for the lights to fully return, but they only brightened enough to cast long shadows across the room. I heard the soft shift of pressure inside the pod, the kind that only happened when the internal temperature changed rapidly. The creature lifted one hand slowly, placing it against the glass right where my chest aligned. I froze, unable to look away from its fingers, which were thinner than they should have been. The glass fogged slightly from the contact, as though something warm pulsed through its skin. I exhaled slowly, trying to convince myself the barrier would hold. We designed these pods to withstand immense pressure, but right now, all I could think about was how fragile everything felt. The room felt even smaller than usual, and every part of me wanted to flee, yet I couldn't bring myself to look away. That unbroken stare held me there, pinned by something deeper than fear. I wondered briefly if this was the same feeling Lena described before she disappeared from the project entirely. She had mentioned a moment where one of the subjects seemed too alert, too aware, and then she vanished without explanation. The facility director insisted she transferred, but her locker remained untouched for weeks. A soft vibration traveled through the floor, almost like a pulse moving beneath the metal plating. The pod monitors flickered again, and for a split second, the subject's eyes seemed brighter, almost reflective. I felt a pressure in my chest, like someone was pushing lightly but firmly against my sternum. I wanted to call for help again, but the intercom light had gone dark, no longer taking input. Whatever was happening in this room now felt entirely separate from the rest of the station, as if some boundary had closed around me the moment those eyes opened. Then the temperature in the room dropped suddenly, not gradually, but sharply enough to make my breath hitch. The subject slowly tilted its head, observing me with a curiosity that felt far too intelligent. I told myself the sedation must be wearing off at an uneven rate, but that didn't explain the awareness, the deliberate motion, or the impossibility of its open eyes. I felt the instinctual terror of being watched by something that didn't blink, didn't shift weight, didn't breathe the way a human body should. For a moment, everything felt suspended, the hum, the cold, my own heartbeat. The subject pressed its hand harder against the glass, and I noticed the faintest indentation forming beneath its palm. The barrier was holding, but the pressure seemed alarmingly intentional. I stepped sideways, inching toward the exit while keeping my eyes locked on the pod. The lights flickered again, longer this time, and the shadows in the room stretched upward, as if being pulled. I whispered, "Don't do this," though I wasn't sure if I meant the creature or myself. Just as I reached the doorway, the pod released a deep internal shift, like something resetting or preparing to move. I had seconds to decide whether to stay or run. I tightened my grip on the doorframe, forcing myself to take one final look at the creature inside. It wasn't glaring or snarling, or doing anything dramatic. It simply watched me with those unnatural eyes, wide and bright, as though understanding exactly what I feared most. And then its shoulders twitched forward, the smallest movement, but enough to make my breath stop entirely. I didn't wait to see what it planned next. I stepped fully into the hall, my heartbeat thudding heavy in my throat. But before I could take another step, the emergency lock engaged behind me, sealing the room with a metallic snap that echoed through the corridor like a buried heartbeat. I stared at the sealed door, trying to calm the shaking in my hands, but the last thing I saw before it closed was those eyes shifting toward me, alert and aware. Something inside that room was awake in the worst possible way, and I realized with sickening certainty that the rule existed for a reason. Never approach a subject if its eyes open before the lights do, because whatever opened its eyes in Pod 7 wasn't waking up, it was waiting. And now it knew exactly where I was. The corridor lights dimmed as if reacting to the same presence I felt pressing against the sealed door. I took one slow step backward, breathing shallow and shaky, trying not to imagine the thing inside testing its limits. That was when I heard the faint shift of metal from behind the door, followed by a low vibration moving through the hallway floor. I realized the facility wasn't simply malfunctioning. Something inside was trying to reach me, not physically, but through the structure itself, like it was using the lab as an extension of its own body. I braced myself, unable to look away from the sealed door, as the vibration grew stronger, deeper, almost curious. The door lights flickered. The seal released with a soft mechanical click, and the handle began to move. I remembered Rule 2. Never enter the blind zone alone. Even if the light seemed stable the moment I stepped toward the far end of the lab, where the maintenance tunnel led into darkness. The air felt thicker here, like the water outside the reinforced glass had pressed in through every crack, though I knew it hadn't. Shadows stretched oddly along the walls, as if they had weight and could reach for me, and I realized that every sound I made echoed differently, bouncing off walls that shouldn't have been there. I tried to focus on the control panel beside me, but my hands shook as if the currents themselves were trying to push me back. The blind zone began a few meters past the last monitoring station, a stretch of corridor the cameras refused to capture fully. I checked my equipment, ensuring my backup lights were functioning, even though I knew the dim glow they cast barely cut through the darkness. Lena had always warned me that the first mistake most divers made was overconfidence, thinking the corridors were safe because the sensors read normal. The deeper I went, the more I felt eyes on me, though the pods were empty and the hall silent. As I moved further, I could feel the temperature drop, subtle at first, then sharper, like someone was breathing against my neck. I tried to convince myself it was just the lab's environmental control, but instinct told me otherwise. A low vibration ran under my boots, almost like the floor itself was alive, shifting ever so slightly with every step. I whispered under my breath, "This is fine, just the blind zone. Nothing else," yet the words felt hollow, and my heartbeat answered them with doubt. The walls here weren't just shadows, they seemed to pulse faintly, as though the darkness itself had veins and a rhythm. I slowed my pace, gripping the rail with both hands while peeking into the deeper part of the corridor. Something moved out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of shape that vanished when I turned toward it. I told myself I was imagining it, yet my instincts screamed that imagination couldn't make shadows this deliberate. The air smelled heavier here, faintly metallic, and every breath I took felt like I was inhaling pressure itself. Halfway through the blind zone, my flashlight flickered, and for a split second the hallway was nothing but shadows and that faint pulse of blue-green light. I froze, remembering the drills about movement in zero visibility zones, and whispered, "Stay calm, don't provoke it," even though no one could hear me. A soft scrape echoed somewhere behind me, slow and deliberate, like metal against metal, but when I swung my head around, nothing was there. My stomach twisted as I realized the sound had moved ahead of me faster than it should have been. The further I went, the more I could sense a presence, not just the absence of light. It was watching, waiting, aware of every step, every shallow breath, I reminded myself again of the rule, the very reason we were warned never to enter here alone. Never enter the blind zone alone, even if the light seems stable. The words replayed in my mind like a lifeline, tethering me to a small thread of sanity. I could almost hear Lena's voice warning me that curiosity in this lab could be fatal, yet my legs moved forward, despite the dread coiling in my chest. A sudden shift in pressure made me stumble, my flashlight swinging and illuminating the far wall just long enough for me to see movement that had no source. It was fast, precise, and impossible for a human, or anything I had trained for, to produce. I swallowed hard and whispered, "Focus, just focus on the rail." But even as I clung to the railing, my pulse raced faster than it ever had inside the lab. The corridor seemed to stretch, elongating unnaturally, as if trying to disorient me, and I realized the blind zone didn't obey the physics I knew. Then the vibration grew stronger, like footsteps pacing just beyond the edge of the light, circling me without a sound. My breath hitched, my flashlight flicked again, and I saw a shadow move across the ceiling above me, too fluid and too deliberate to be anything mechanical. "Who's there?" I called, my voice cracking as it echoed back, warped and strange. No answer came, only the subtle shift in pressure, a heartbeat in the floor, syncing somehow with my own. The blind zone seemed alive, aware, and intent on testing the one rule I had just broken by stepping in alone. I remembered the emergency protocol drilled into us. Never panic, maintain orientation, retreat slowly, if anything moves unexpectedly. I tried to follow it, counting steps carefully, my back never leaving the rail, eyes scanning for any sign of the unnatural presence. Every shadow seemed to watch, every flicker of light revealed shapes that shouldn't exist, and I realized the zone wasn't just dark, it was selective. It allowed you to see just enough to doubt yourself and nothing more. My chest tightened as I thought, one false move, and I might be trapped here, forever. As I neared the midpoint, a shape coalesced in the periphery, a figure, faintly humanoid, emerging from the shadows yet impossible to focus on fully. I could feel it measuring me, gauging my steps, almost as if it were testing whether I would survive the blind zone. I whispered to myself, "I remember Rule 2, letting the words anchor me." The figure shifted again, faster this time, and the lights flickered violently, leaving me suspended between fear and disbelief. I realized then that I was not alone, and the blind zone didn't forgive trespassers. The hallway narrowed suddenly, and the shadows behind the figure seemed to reach for me. My grip on the railing tightened until my knuckles whitened, and I felt a cold draft brushing my neck, though no ventilation existed here. I told myself the rule was my shield, that the blind zone had boundaries I understood, but instinct screamed otherwise. The figure paused, tilting its head slightly, as if curious. I could feel my pulse echo in the floor, in the walls, and in the space between us. Every instinct screamed to flee, but the way the entity watched me, it wanted something, and I wasn't sure it was leaving peacefully. By the time I reached the end of the blind zone, my legs burned, my chest constricted, and my mind raced. Every shadow, every pulse of vibration, had been a warning I couldn't ignore. The exit was just a few steps away, but I knew this was only a test of the first rule's endurance, and my obedience to the second. I whispered once more, "Never enter the blind zone alone," even as the figure seemed to linger just beyond the reach of the light, waiting for my next mistake. The air felt heavier as I passed into the lit corridor, but I knew the blind zone had not released me entirely. The light stabilized, the shadows resumed their normal angles, and I forced myself to breathe. My hands shook as I checked the monitors, but the figure was gone, or perhaps it had never been there at all. Yet the oppressive feeling lingered, as though some part of the blind zone had followed me into the light, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a question gnawed at me: had I really survived it, or had it allowed me to leave only to watch my next step more closely? I forced myself to steady my breathing as I reached the medical wing, repeating Rule 3. If a sleeper's vitals drop below baseline, do not speak their name in my mind like a quiet chant. The monitoring room hummed with soft machinery, yet something in the air felt sharper than usual, like the silence itself was listening. When I stepped closer to Pod 7, the glass fogged slightly, as if something inside had exhaled a breath colder than the surrounding water. I leaned in to examine the vitals, and a thin alarm light blinked, not urgent, but warning, almost hesitant, as though it didn't want to alert me too loudly. The sleepers looked peaceful to anyone who hadn't been here long enough to understand the danger hidden beneath that calm. Years ago, Lena told me, their minds go deeper than the ocean. Don't disturb them unless you want something else to wake instead. Tonight, that sentence felt uncomfortably relevant. Pod 7's vitals dipped again, the baseline line trembling downward for a single moment before stabilizing. My throat tightened, not because I feared the drop, but because my first instinct had been to whisper the sleeper's name, and I caught myself just in time. I reached out to adjust the thermal regulators, but the glass shifted temperature the moment my fingers hovered over it, hot, then cold, then neutral, as though someone inside dragged their hand along the opposite side. The sensation made me step back, pulse quickening. Not again, I muttered, though part of me wondered if this was still the after effect of the blind zone or something entirely different. The lights dimmed for a heartbeat, just long enough for the silhouette in the pod to look like it had turned its head toward me. For a moment, I heard something faint, a muffled tapping, soft and rhythmic. It wasn't loud enough to be a distress signal, nor random enough to dismiss as equipment noise. I leaned closer, careful not to speak, and the tapping stopped abruptly, as if it sensed my attention. A whisper of movement coiled through the room, so subtle it was like the air shifted around me. I could almost feel the sleeper's presence, not just physically but mentally, as though their thoughts brushed the edge of mine. The monitor flickered, and for a split second, the baseline dipped again, deeper this time, pulling a long, thin tone from the vitals screen. Instinct forced my lips apart to say their name, but I clamped them shut, breath shaking. A sudden cold spread across the floor, creeping around my boots like frost forming in seconds. The pod's silhouette twitched, but not in any way human, more like something adjusting itself into the shape of what it remembered being. My skin prickled as I realized its movements grew sharper. Each time the baseline faltered, a soft hum rolled through the lab, steady and low, like a lullaby sung underwater. I didn't recognize the frequency, but the pod reacted immediately, shifting, settling, almost listening. For a moment, I watched the vitals rise, stabilized, then hovered dangerously near the baseline once more. My reflection in the glass looked thinner, more pale under the dim lights, and the silhouette behind it loomed just a little too close. I stepped away again, afraid to even think the sleeper's name, worried the thought alone might count as calling them. The room's temperature continued to fluctuate in unnatural waves, and shadows at the far wall thickened into darker shapes. I fought the urge to check the hall behind me, knowing sudden movement could trigger another drop in the pod's vitals. Every few seconds, the sleeper shifted, slow, deliberate movements that didn't match the patterns I had monitored for years. It reminded me of something waking up not physically, but cognitively, becoming aware of me in a way it hadn't before. The baseline dipped again without warning, sharp enough that the monitor blared a short, distorted tone. The silhouette jerked, the tapping resumed, and the frost on the floor started to spread faster, climbing the pod's outer shell in thin branches. My instinct screamed at me to call for backup, to shout the sleeper's name, anything, but the rule held my voice hostage. Saying their name during a baseline drop was an invitation we could not afford to extend. Then for the first time, the pod's internal lights flickered on by themselves, flooding the chamber with a pale blue glow. The figure inside pressed closer to the glass, face obscured but posture unmistakably alert. The tapping stopped, the air grew heavy again, pressing down on my chest with the weight of deep water. I could hear my own pulse louder than the machine's, and for a terrible moment, the silhouette raised its hand slowly, mimicking the gesture of someone trying to get my attention. I stepped back, forcing my breath to remain steady. The vitals returned to stable, but only barely. The figure inside the pod lowered its hand with an uncanny smoothness. The pod's lights dimmed once more, the frost receded, and the room slowly exhaled as if relieved. Yet I couldn't shake the certainty that it wasn't just a fluctuation in vitals. Something had noticed me, and it hadn't finished watching. I remembered Rule 4. Never let a subject see your reflection as I stepped cautiously into the observation chamber, my hands gripping the railing tighter than necessary. The glass walls of the lab reflected the dim overhead lights, and for a second, I caught the fleeting impression of someone, or something, standing just behind me. My own reflection stared back, pale and tense, and I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I told myself to move slowly, eyes averted, but instinct drew me back toward the panels where the pods lined the walls like silent sentinels. Pod 7 had been quiet since the vitals normalized, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the silhouette inside was aware in a new way. The reflection rule had been drilled into us as a precaution. Eyes could mirror and multiply what the sleepers perceived. Even the slightest glimpse of my own face might trigger recognition, curiosity, or something worse. I felt my heart hammer as I edged around the corner, trying to avoid the smooth reflective panels that lined the hall. Yet every shadow seemed to warp like liquid metal. A distant echo caught my attention, a soft, rhythmic tapping along the outer glass of the observation pods. My pulse quickened. I wasn't sure if it was mechanical or deliberate. I muttered under my breath, careful not to speak to Pod 7. Keep still, don't notice me. I could feel the presence behind the glass growing, subtle but undeniable. My own reflection trembled in the peripheral light, as if it were alive, stretching toward me in ways my body did not move. As I moved further into the chamber, the corridor narrowed, forcing me to pass reflections at every angle. I angled my head down, forcing my eyes to the floor, but I felt the weight of unseen attention pressing in. A cold draft crawled along the spine of the hallway, and for a heartbeat, I could swear the shadows of the pods stretched like fingers toward me. I whispered a silent warning to myself. Never let a subject see your reflection. Every instinct screamed to obey. The dim light of the observation room flickered once, and I caught a glimpse of something moving behind Pod 5's glass. Not fully formed, more like a ripple of darkness, but unmistakably aware. I froze mid-step, knowing that even if I didn't see its face, my reflection might. My breath hitched, shallow and fast. I could feel the tension in the air coiling tighter, as if the lab itself were holding its breath. I tried to focus on the control panel, pulling the nearest lever, and forcing the doors of adjacent pods into lockdown mode. Pod 7's silhouette shifted again, slower this time, deliberately. The movement made my stomach twist. Shadows at the corner of my eye bent unnaturally, reflecting not just me, but something that seemed to copy my posture. I whispered once more to myself, the rule exists for a reason. One slip, one glance, could change everything. The reflective panels lining the chamber seemed to ripple like water under pressure. My own eyes, peeking up too quickly, caught the faintest echo of a face that shouldn't exist. Not mine, not human, somewhere between a memory and an entity waiting for me to falter. I leaned back instinctively, hand pressed to my mouth, trying to calm my breathing. Every panel I passed became a test, every shadow, a question I didn't want to answer. I reached the end of the corridor and paused, my chest tightening, knowing that even though I had avoided full reflections, the lab itself seemed to watch. A faint movement in Pod 7 drew my gaze. Despite my efforts, a shape that pressed lightly against the glass. I didn't look directly at it, but my mind screamed that it had noticed me, the way it always did when I was careless. The air grew thick, oppressive, like the water outside pushing against the walls with weight. Then the lights flickered again, and for a brief moment, my reflection warped into something I did not recognize. It was taller, thinner, with eyes far too bright for a human face. I stumbled back, almost colliding with the railing. Pod 7's shadow shifted simultaneously, as if reacting to the distorted reflection. I pressed my palms to the cold metal, whispering a mantra, "Never let a subject see your reflection." The words barely anchored me, but I clung to them like a lifeline. As I edged toward the next hallway, I realized the chamber's air had thickened, carrying a faint metallic scent that made my stomach turn. The silhouette behind the glass hadn't moved, but the awareness of it, combined with the reflection, made it feel alive in a new way. My pulse raced, the flickering lights mirrored shadows I didn't understand, and I understood why the rule had been created. One glance, one mistake, and whatever awareness I had managed to avoid could reach me. I paused before stepping into the adjoining corridor, chest heaving, knowing that the next segment of the lab was unmonitored and deeper than anything I had faced before. Pod 7 remained still, yet its presence pressed through the glass and into my thoughts. I whispered silently. One last reminder to myself, repeating the rule like a shield. Never let a subject see your reflection. And as I moved forward, I felt the first true weight of the underwater lab's intelligence pressing down, testing the limits of my obedience and my sanity. I slowed my pace as I stepped into the unmonitored corridor, forcing myself to remember Rule 5. If you hear your own voice calling you, do not answer it. The hallway ahead was narrower than the others, lined with pipes that hummed faintly beneath the pressure of circulating seawater. My breaths felt louder here, too loud, almost as if the air carried them down the hall before I could exhale. I kept my eyes straight, resisting the urge to look back toward Pod 7, even though I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched from far behind me. The lights grew dimmer as I walked, flickering in a subtle pattern that almost resembled a heartbeat. I tried to convince myself it was only the generator adjusting to the power draw from the main lab, but a part of me knew better. The underwater lab had a way of making natural phenomena feel personal, like it understood how to use silence and rhythm to unsettle us. I tightened my grip on the railing as a distant hum deepened, vibrating through the metal and into my palm. Halfway through the passage, I paused when I noticed the condensation forming on the walls, thin trails of moisture sliding down in long, uneven streaks. It looked like fingerprints dragged across fogged glass, not random patterns of humidity. My pulse quickened, and I took a slow breath to steady myself before pushing onward. I reminded myself that the unmonitored corridors were older, less stable, prone to structural echoes that sometimes imitated movement. At least, that was what I hoped. The corridor curved gently to the left, disappearing into a darker section where the emergency lights cast long, narrow beams across the floor. As I stepped closer, the hum of the pipes shifted, producing a tone that felt almost deliberate. I pressed my palm to the cool metal, trying to determine if the vibration was mechanical or something else entirely. The temperature of the air dipped sharply, cold enough to make my skin prickle, as if invisible droplets of ocean water clung to the surface of my uniform. I continued forward, but the silence deepened behind me in a way that felt unnatural. It wasn't just quiet, it was attentive, like the hallway was listening for something. As I turned the corner, the emergency lights flickered again, and I froze, startled by a faint sound from the opposite end of the hall. It wasn't footsteps or machinery. It was softer, almost muffled, as if carried through several layers of water. I strained to listen, hoping I had imagined it. Then I heard it, my own voice calling my name. I stopped dead, every muscle locking in place as that familiar tone drifted through the corridor with fragile calm. The voice wasn't frightened or urgent. If anything, it sounded patient, almost gentle, repeating my name in the same cadence I used when speaking on audio logs. My mouth went dry. I clenched my hands, reminding myself that I had followed the rule line by line for years, but hearing the voice now made uncertainty claw at my thoughts. The voice grew clearer, matching my tone too perfectly to ignore. I forced my eyes to the ground, refusing to look toward the sound source. Part of me wanted to respond, to say something simple like what or who's there. but the rest of me clung desperately to silence. The corridor seemed to inhale around me, the temperature dropping a few degrees as the voice repeated the call. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, drowning out everything except that one impossible echo. I took a step backward, afraid that moving forward might bring me closer to whatever was calling. The voice answered the movement with another soft repetition of my name, this time closer, more distinct. I pictured the empty hallway stretching behind me, dim lights, fogged walls, the flickering shadows, yet the voice sounded as though it came from just an arm's length away. I pressed my back against the cold metal railing, breathing in shallow bursts while trying to keep my mind steady. The memory of our training came back sharply. The voice would always sound familiar, always sound like a perfect imitation. It was meant to lure, to break isolation, to make the target respond. Once you responded, it knew exactly where you were, both physically and mentally. The consequences of being found were never written in the manuals, but everyone understood them well enough. A few researchers had broken the rule, none had returned. The voice shifted again, softer now, as if it sensed my fear. It spoke my name with the unsteady warmth of someone pretending to be concerned. Instinct pushed me toward answering. It felt rude not to, like I was ignoring myself, but terror anchored my tongue. I trembled, gripping the railing until my fingers ached. My breath fogged in the cold air, and for a moment I thought I saw a faint shape forming in the fog, tall and thin, its outline barely perceptible. Without thinking, I pushed myself forward, turning away from the sound and moving deeper into the hallway. It didn't stop the voice. It followed, repeating my name in a calm, coaxing whisper that slid along the floor behind me like a trail of reaching fingers. My steps quickened, though I fought the urge to run. Running made noise. Noise invited attention, and attention led to mistakes. I swallowed hard, forcing my legs to carry me toward the access hatch at the far end. When I reached the hatch, my hands shook so violently that I struggled to grip the handle. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, trying to focus on the memory of Pod 7, the reflection rule, the vitals dropping, all of it reminding me why these rules existed. The voice called my name again, even closer now, so close I could feel breath against the back of my neck. I tensed, refusing to turn around. I twisted the hatch lock, pulling it open just wide enough to slip through. The voice repeated my name one last time, this time with a tone that almost resembled disappointment. I stepped through the opening, yanked the hatch shut, and pressed my weight against it until the seal clamped tight. The corridor on the other side vibrated faintly, as if something brushed past the doorway. Only then did the voice finally fade into silence. And as the air in the new corridor settled, I realized the silence wasn't reassuring. It felt like the beginning of something far worse, something that had found me, but was waiting for a better moment to act. I froze as I entered the next observation chamber, forcing myself to remember Rule 6. Never trust a subject that smiles while sedated. Pod 7 wasn't the only sleeper in the lab, and as I scanned the rows of stasis chambers, I noticed one figure whose features were unsettlingly serene. Its lips curved slightly, just enough to form a faint, impossible smile. I shivered, knowing that in a sedated state, a human being should never have the control or awareness to produce such a gesture. My breath caught in my throat as I realized how much attention it seemed to demand. The faint smile stayed fixed, even as I adjusted the monitors, checking vitals and temperature levels for anomalies. Everything read normal, yet that expression, so deliberate and calm, made my pulse spike. I reminded myself that the rule existed for a reason. The lab's history was full of researchers who ignored signs like this, thinking a smile meant harmlessness. They didn't last long. Lena had mentioned once that even the slightest deviation from natural repose could be the difference between survival and calamity. I edged closer to Pod 12, keeping my eyes trained on the vitals, but my peripheral vision refused to release the smiling figure. The air seemed to grow heavier here, as if compressing around me, pressing against my chest. I felt my hands clammy on the railing, heart hammering in a rhythm that almost matched the pulsing lights of the pod. The smile was subtle, but there was intent behind it, a calm observation that made it feel like it knew I was here, calculating every small movement I made. For a moment I imagined it might just be a trick of the lighting, the way shadows bent around the stasis fluid, but my instinct screamed at me to step back, to give the pod a wide berth, and not to trust even the slightest hint of awareness in a sedated subject. I muttered to myself, trying to maintain calm, "It's just a body, nothing else." But the words felt hollow, swallowed by the tension in the room. Every instinct told me this was a predator masked in a familiar form. I leaned over the console, checking the logs from the last few cycles. Pod 12 had been showing anomalous readings for days. Small deviations in heart rate and brain activity. Nothing alarming enough to trigger alerts. Yet now, under my scrutiny, it felt like the entire pod was aware of my presence. And that smile was the warning I had ignored. My mind raced through scenarios, desperately trying to rationalize what I saw. None of them made sense. It wasn't human behavior. It was something else entirely, calculating and patient. The corridor lights dimmed slightly, elongating shadows across the floor, and I felt a pressure in the air that made my skin crawl. My pulse quickened, and I reminded myself silently of the rule again. One misstep, one movement that betrayed fear or curiosity, and it could respond in ways I couldn't anticipate. I took a careful step back, trying to keep the monitor in my line of sight, while avoiding direct observation of the smile. It felt like a test, and I was failing by simply existing in the room. The hum of the lab's machinery seemed to thrum in time with my heartbeat, echoing in the silence around me. The sedated subjects remained motionless, or so it seemed, but the smile on Pod 12 persisted. I noticed subtle changes in the ambient light, shadows shifting closer to the glass as though leaning toward me. My throat tightened as I considered retreating, but instinctively I knew that turning my back would make me vulnerable. The rule existed to protect me, yet I felt it more as a warning than a shield. In this moment, I forced myself to record the vitals, hands shaking as I typed in the latest figures, trying not to glance at that unsettling expression. The smile didn't change, yet I felt its awareness deepening with every passing second. I whispered under my breath, stay calm," but the words felt weak and unconvincing. There was intelligence here I didn't want to acknowledge, something ancient and deliberate, hiding beneath the guise of sedation. I realized with a sinking dread that the rule was a reminder of what I could not see and what I should never provoke. A faint vibration passed through the floor, subtle enough that it could have been the station settling, but my gut told me otherwise. Pod 12's fingers twitched lightly against the glass, almost like it was testing the boundary between the fluid and the air outside. I swallowed hard, forcing my eyes back to the monitors, though my peripheral vision caught the tiniest shift of light along the edges of the pod. Every instinct screamed at me to leave the room, to respect the rule that warned me against trusting a smiling subject. As I edged toward the exit, my hands on the cold railing, the smile seemed to stretch, not physically, but in presence. It lingered in the periphery, in the reflection of the floor, in the echo of my own movements. My heart hammered in my chest, and for the first time, I felt a creeping certainty that the rule wasn't about the sleeper itself. It was about me, about how easily a researcher could fall into a trap simply by believing appearances. I whispered silently, repeating the rule once more in my mind as I pressed forward. Reaching the end of the corridor, I felt a shift in the air, subtle but undeniable, like a breath brushing the back of my neck. I paused at the hatch, hands trembling, and glanced briefly at the pod before forcing myself to look away. The smile hadn't vanished. It was just waiting, patient and calm, as though it knew I would not respond, but would remember this moment forever. I exhaled, forcing my body to move through the hatch, the knowledge of Rule 6 etched painfully into my thoughts. Whatever was behind that smile, it wasn't human, and it had been waiting for me to see it. I gripped the railing and reminded myself, Rule 7. Always keep the emergency hatch between you and the pods at all times. As I reached the next corridor leading toward the deep maintenance shaft, Pod 12's unsettling smile lingered in my memory, and every instinct screamed that I could not afford a misstep. The hatch ahead was heavy, metallic, and almost warm under my fingers, a small barrier between me and whatever intelligence had been watching me. I exhaled slowly, trying to focus on the physical reality of the hatch rather than the oppressive sense of awareness pressing against me from the pods. The corridor beyond the hatch was narrower, with pipes lining the ceiling that hummed with a subtle vibration I could feel in my chest. The shadows between the supports shifted as I passed, and my mind refused to let me relax. Every reflection from the polished metal walls seemed to imitate my movements, though nothing else was moving. I forced myself to remember the rule, pressing my back against the hatch before turning the heavy handle and sliding it shut behind me. The sound echoed faintly, sealing me off from the pods, though the sense of being watched didn't fade. I paused for a moment, letting the pressure in my chest ease slightly. The emergency hatch was designed to protect personnel in the rare case a pod malfunctioned or a subject became unstable. But now it felt like my only lifeline against the subtle intelligence in the lab. Pod 12 was silent now, yet I could feel a presence lingering through the walls, pressing against the hatch as though it could sense the barrier between us. Every step I took forward felt like crossing a tightrope with no safety net beneath me. A faint vibration ran along the hatch floor, pulsing like a heartbeat, and I pressed my palm flat against the cold metal. It trembled slightly, almost as if the pod on the other side were testing its strength. My breath came fast, shallow, and I whispered silently, "Stay between the hatch and the pods. Stay safe." I could feel the familiar tension of the lab pressing inward, compressing everything into a narrow, tense tunnel where one miscalculation could be fatal. The hatch wasn't just a barrier, it was a lifeline, a small piece of reality that kept me anchored. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the air became. The metallic hum of the corridor combined with the faint vibrations of the pods beyond created a rhythm I couldn't ignore. I forced my focus on the emergency hatch, tracing its edges, feeling its weight beneath my fingertips, reminding myself that it was my shield. Even as I moved forward, the memory of the smiling sleeper haunted me, and I realized how little I could trust any presence in the lab. One slip, one distraction, and the rule would be meaningless. I moved cautiously, keeping the hatch behind me at all times, feeling the subtle pressure of awareness pressing through the walls. Shadows shifted in the corners of my vision, elongating and retreating with the flickering of the overhead lights. I told myself it was just my imagination, but instinct screamed otherwise. The hatch was more than metal, it was my barrier from the subtle intelligence that waited in the pods. Moving without it between me and them would be foolish, suicidal even. A faint pulse of cold air brushed past my neck, and I froze mid-step. I couldn't see it, yet I knew something was observing me through the walls, measuring my hesitation. The hatch behind me remained solid and immovable, but the sensation of being watched persisted. I whispered a silent prayer, telling myself that the rule existed to protect me, that my focus and obedience were all that stood between me and disaster. Yet even as I repeated the mantra, the weight of the lab's consciousness pressed closer. I rounded the corner into the next chamber, keeping my back firmly toward the hatch, never letting myself glance over my shoulder. Every reflection, every shadow, seemed to bend toward me, testing whether I would falter. I adjusted the lighting panel to keep the hallway ahead fully illuminated, but the corridor felt alive, responding to my presence, monitoring my compliance with the rule. The emergency hatch was my only constant, a boundary that reminded me of where I was safe and where danger began. As I approached the next set of pod clusters, I felt the subtle vibration intensify, almost like a pulse running through the floor. It synced with my own heartbeat, and I realized that the lab wasn't just observing, it was communicating. I pressed against the hatch instinctively, drawing comfort from the weight of solid metal between myself and the unseen entities beyond. Every instinct screamed that one misstep would nullify my barrier, and I fought to move cautiously, step by deliberate step. The hallway narrowed again, forcing me to keep the hatch directly behind me without deviation. The shadows elongated unnaturally, and the reflection of the dim lights played tricks on my mind, making me see movement where none existed. I reminded myself of Rule 7 for the last time, letting it anchor my fear as I prepared to cross this section of the lab. Whatever was beyond the hatch was aware, waiting, and patient. My focus had to be absolute. My survival depended entirely on it. I finally reached the far end of the corridor and paused, feeling the weight of isolation in this part of the lab. The emergency hatch behind me seemed to hum slightly, as if acknowledging my obedience. I exhaled, my hands still pressed against the cold metal, and realized the rule wasn't just about physical safety. It was a reminder of boundaries I couldn't afford to violate. I took a final glance at the pod's shadows across the corridor, then moved through the next hatchway, heart pounding, knowing that I had obeyed, for now. The hall ahead was dimmer than I remembered, and as I stepped forward, my tablet vibrated sharply in my hand. A red notification pulsed on the screen. Pod 9 system log unresponsive. My blood ran cold. Rule 8. If a pod stops responding to the system logs, do not investigate it alone, echoed in my mind immediately. The lab seemed to inhale with me, the air tightening as though it already anticipated my reaction. I took a slow breath, refusing to let fear make the decisions for me. The silence in this corridor wasn't normal. It felt intentional, like the lab itself was waiting for me to forget the rule. I glanced toward Pod 9's isolation chamber at the far end. Its observation window was completely dark, not powered down, just dark. The corridor lights flickered in a soft ripple, as though something on the other side of the glass had moved. My instincts pushed me back a step, reminding me that curiosity in this place was deadly. I tapped the side panel interface, hoping for a glitch, a delayed ping, anything. The system responded to every command except the one involving Pod 9. Request declined, repeated across the screen, each message slower than the last, as if something were intercepting the command before the system could process it. A subtle vibration pulsed through the floor, traveling up my legs in a slow, cold rhythm. The pod wasn't just offline, it was aware. I forced myself to activate the staff channel on my comms, but the line crackled with static instead of the usual automated confirmation. The distortion had shape, like breathing layered behind the static. I stepped back again, pulse accelerating as the shadows near the chamber shifted, too deliberately to be caused by lights. Something was moving in synchronized patterns, as if pacing. Investigating alone would mean stepping into the dark, with something that did not want to be monitored. The air around the isolation room vibrated faintly, and a low hum bled through the walls, like a distant mechanical groan. I knew better than to mistake it for machinery. The pods never made noise unless something inside forced them to. My fingers tightened around the tablet, and I whispered the rule under my breath, letting it anchor my fear. No matter how silent the hallway became, no matter how much the pod seemed to call for attention, I would not take a single step toward it alone. Then, as if responding, the window to Pod 9 lit up for less than a heartbeat, just long enough for a silhouette to appear against the glass, head tilted, unmoving, watching me from inside. The light snapped off immediately, leaving only the afterimage burned into my vision. My breath hitched, and the corridor returned to its suffocating silence. Whatever was in Pod 9 had moved closer to the window deliberately. It wanted me to come alone. It wanted me to break the rule. I backed away slowly, refusing to let the silence swallow my reasoning. I kept my eyes on the window, knowing better than to turn my back fully. The silhouette didn't reappear, but the oppressive air told me it was still there, waiting just beyond the glass. I reached for the emergency alert panel, one meant strictly for reporting rule violations and pod anomalies, and pressed the call request with a shaking finger. The panel responded instantly, far faster than normal, as though someone had been waiting on the other end. The corridor lights flickered again, this time in a steady pattern, guiding me back the way I came. The lab had its own awareness, its own logic, and sometimes it helped us, if only to prevent a catastrophe it didn't want. I followed the light trail cautiously, every sense sharpened. The farther I moved from Pod 9, the less the air vibrated, and the oppressive silence eased into something breathable. Only when the corridor behind me finally straightened and brightened did I realize I was safe, at least for now. I stopped near the next hatchway, my heart still pounding, and let the tension drain from my shoulders. Even as I waited for the support team to respond, I couldn't shake the lingering sensation that Pod 9 was still watching me through the walls, marking me, recognizing that I had resisted its pull. I had obeyed the rule, but the encounter left a truth I couldn't ignore. Something inside that pod didn't want to be monitored anymore, and it wasn't done with me. The support team still hadn't arrived, and I was stuck in the transition corridor when a new alert flashed across my tablet. Observation Hatch D3 manual seal engaged. My breath tightened because Rule 9, never open a sealed observation hatch unless all 3 status lights are green, had been drilled into us so many times it felt like muscle memory. The problem was that Hatch D3 didn't lead to a storage room or hallway. It led directly into the auxiliary chamber, overlooking several dormant subjects. A manual seal meant someone had either forced it shut or forced it open. I hesitated before turning the corner toward the hatch, already expecting the lights to be anything but green. D3 was rarely used, and nobody had any reason to be in there tonight. The dim blue glow of the emergency lights stretched the shadows ahead, making the hatch look farther away than it really was. My steps felt heavier the closer I got, as though the pressure from the deeper parts of the facility settled on my shoulders. When I reached the hatch, my stomach dropped. Only one of the 3 lights glowed, yellow. The other 2 were dead. That meant the hatch wasn't secure, not fully locked, not fully open. Something in between. I leaned closer, careful not to touch it, and tried to peer through the narrow viewing slit. The glass was fogged from the inside, smeared with long streaks that dragged downward. They didn't look like condensation patterns. They looked deliberate, as if someone had traced fingers along the glass in slow, searching lines. I stepped back instinctively, resisting the impulse to wipe the slit clear. Knowing this place, seeing inside might have been worse than not knowing. My tablet pinged again, but this time, the notification was truncated, fragmented, like the message had been intercepted before it could reach me. I tried opening it, but all I saw was a half sentence. Subject movement detected, and then static. My chest tightened. The auxiliary chamber contained 3 dormant subjects, none of them scheduled for evaluation or transfer tonight. They should not be moving at all. I kept forcing myself to breathe steadily, reminding myself that curiosity around a half-sealed hatch was the kind of thing that got people erased from the logs. I checked the emergency comm panel beside the hatch, but when I pressed the call button, the system didn't respond. It didn't even blink. It was as if the panel was nothing more than a dead metal plate. I stepped back again and looked at the corridor behind me. The silence felt different here, thick, damp, like the air carried something it shouldn't. This section of the lab was closer to the older parts of the structure, where echoes traveled strangely, bending through the halls as if they had intentions. Something shifted behind the hatch. I didn't see it, not clearly, but I felt it. A slow pressure against the other side, subtle enough that the hatch barely creaked in its frame, but strong enough to send a tremor through the floor. I froze. The smear marks on the viewing slit were fresh. Whatever had made them was still inside that chamber, standing closer to the hatch than I wanted to imagine. I tried to steady my breathing, but the air tasted metallic, colder than the rest of the corridor. The sealed hatch hadn't been sealed by accident. Something had pushed against it hard enough to force an override. I took another step back when the bottom of the hatch vibrated slightly, as though something traced along the floor inside, moving slowly. The vibration ran up my legs, and for a moment, I felt like the lab itself was warning me. I whispered the rule to myself in a low breath, not daring to speak louder. Never open a hatch unless all 3 lights were green. If 2 were dead, then the chamber was compromised, and opening the door would be suicide. Worse than suicide, actually. Some things didn't kill you right away. They changed you. I pulled up the manual logs on my tablet, hoping to check if a technician had been assigned to D3 earlier. The log was blank, not empty blank, as if the last several hours had been wiped clean from that section's record. That had only happened once before in the lab's history, during an incident they never fully explained to new staff. The blank logs were a sign that something inside the chamber was interfering with the system, not unintentionally, deliberately. Like Pod 9, but older, stronger. My throat dried as another shift pressed against the hatch, heavier this time. I didn't move closer, didn't dare. I watched as a faint outline appeared behind the fogged viewing slit, a tall, distorted silhouette leaning in as though listening to my heartbeat through the steel. The shape didn't move normally. It lengthened and contracted subtly, like a body trying to remember proportions it no longer had. I forced myself not to blink, terrified that if I lost sight of the silhouette even for a heartbeat, it would suddenly be somewhere else. The single yellow status light flickered twice, and the 2 dead ones remained dark. If they turned green, just for a moment, protocol would require me to confirm the chamber was safe, but I knew better. Lights didn't go green on their own. The subjects couldn't manipulate the systems directly, at least not physically, but mentally. Some of them could project, influence, lure. The smear marks on the glass, the half-sealed hatch, the wiped logs. This wasn't random. Something wanted the hatch opened, wanted me inside. The silhouette shifted again, leaning closer to the glass until the fog on the inside rippled. A distorted breath, or something pretending to breathe. My heart hammered, and for a moment, I felt pressure in my skull, as though the shape behind the hatch was pushing its awareness into the corridor, searching for me. The light stayed unchanged, but the hatch handle twitched slightly, moving a fraction of an inch on its own. My legs locked in place, fear rooting me where I stood. I swallowed hard and forced myself to step away, slowly, making sure my movements stayed controlled. The shape didn't react, at least not visibly, but the pressure behind the hatch shifted again, as if tracking my distance. I reached the corner of the corridor and stopped, still watching the hatch from afar. The single yellow light pulsed once more, long and slow, as though it were breathing. I whispered to myself that the rule existed for a reason. Whatever was behind that hatch had been waiting for someone to break it. I edged farther away, and only when I was well past the next junction did the pressure in the air finally ease. The silhouette faded from the slit, and the vibration under the floor stopped, but the dread didn't leave. The hatch had been manually sealed for survival, not protocol. Someone had tried to contain whatever was inside, and now it knew the seal wasn't perfect. It had tested the handle, it had reached the viewing slit, it had found me, and the worst part, the system logs still refused to load. That meant the entity inside the chamber was fully aware of the lab's monitoring systems, capable of hiding itself in ways the newer subjects never could. Whatever was in that chamber had been part of the older experiments, the ones we were never meant to interact with, the ones whose rules were written only after people vanished. I kept moving until I reached a safer hallway, and only then did I stop to breathe. The air here felt different, lighter, but the weight of what I had seen lingered. Something inside that sealed chamber had woken earlier than expected, and now it knew I was aware of it. As I waited for the support team to finally respond, a single realization settled in my mind like a cold stone. If the lights ever turned green, even for a second, I would not be opening that hatch, not for anyone. I was halfway back to the central corridor when the lights dimmed again, just slightly, like the lab was taking a long breath before speaking. Then, from somewhere below the grating under my feet, I heard my name, soft, stretched, familiar. My entire body locked up because Rule 10. If you hear someone you know calling your name from inside the lower decks, do not answer is the kind of rule nobody breaks twice. I held my breath and waited, hoping it had been in my head, but the voice drifted upward again, this time clearer, sounding exactly like someone I once trusted. The lower decks were off limits tonight, sealed after a maintenance alert we never fully understood. They were colder than the rest of the facility, and deeper than any of the main pods, stretching into areas built during the very first stage of the lab's construction. It was the kind of place where echoes didn't behave normally, the kind of place where the walls remembered every sound ever made. But the voice I heard wasn't an echo. It used the exact tone and cadence of someone who shouldn't even be in the lab anymore, someone who had been transferred off-site months ago. I knew what that meant. The subjects down there weren't repeating noises. They were mimicking memories. I forced my hands to stay at my sides, even though instinct screamed at me to grip something solid. Answering the call was how these things got inside your head, latching on to any familiar shape they could use. I stepped backward slowly, trying to keep the grating under my feet from vibrating again. If the voice sensed movement, it might start calling more urgently, pressing harder, making itself harder to resist. I focused on my breathing, counting each inhale and exhale like the instructors taught us, grounding myself in the present, not the voice that wanted to pull me downward. The corridor behind me felt too long, too empty, and too exposed. I kept moving until I reached the intersection leading toward the lab's hydro systems wing. The moment I stepped onto solid flooring rather than grated metal, the voice stopped completely. Not faded, not distant, just cut off, like someone had severed a line. The abrupt silence made the hallway feel even more dangerous. It meant the thing calling me knew it had lost its chance, at least for now, and was waiting for another. Waiting for a moment when I was closer, when the rules slipped from my mind. I leaned against the wall to steady myself, trying to figure out why the voice had sounded exactly like Kale, my old shift partner. He used to joke that the lower decks gave him migraines, that the air down there felt heavier than it should. And then one night, he stopped reporting his symptoms, stopped making jokes, stopped talking altogether. A week later, they transferred him without explanation. The official record said he'd been reassigned to a surface facility, but none of us believed that. When I heard his voice under the grate just now, the hair on my arms rose in a way I couldn't ignore. I started down the hydro systems hallway, keeping my steps light, and the subtle change in temperature made the skin on my neck tighten. This wing was warmer, humid from the constant flow of treated water feeding the upper labs. The smell was different too, a faint metallic tang mixed with something damp and earthy, something that reminded me of the very early days of the facility, when we still believed the subjects could be controlled. As I walked deeper into the wing, I could feel the building's old infrastructure humming quietly, a steady rhythm that usually comforted me. Tonight it felt like a warning pulse. When I reached the control hub, I stopped short. The door was slightly ajar, not enough to be considered open, not enough to trigger an alert, but enough that I could see light inside. Someone had been in here recently, or something. I didn't hear breathing or movement, but the air carried a faint residual disturbance, like a shift in pressure left behind after an unwelcome presence. I pushed the door open carefully, bracing myself for anything, but the room appeared empty at first glance. The monitors flickered with static bands running through the water index readings, something that should never happen unless a sensor was tampered with manually. I stepped inside, scanning each corner twice before trusting the silence. The hydro feed showed irregular flow patterns, tiny dips and surges small enough that most staff wouldn't notice. But I noticed. They lined up perfectly with the moment the voice had called my name. Each surge corresponded to the vibration in the grating above the lower decks. It wasn't random. The thing below had used the lab's water circuitry like a conduit to project sound upward. That meant it was learning, adapting, and that terrified me more than the voice itself. As I leaned over the main console, I caught my reflection in the darkened side screen. Except it wasn't just my reflection. For one fragile moment, another outline hovered behind me, taller, heavier set, unmistakably shaped like kale. I blinked, and the second figure vanished, leaving only my pale face staring back. My chest tightened painfully as I backed away from the console. The subjects shouldn't have been able to project images through these screens. Not unless they found a way to manipulate the old wiring beneath the lower decks. Someone must have left the infrastructure too exposed, or something had forced it open from below. I exited the hub quickly, forcing myself not to look over my shoulder even when I felt the hull stretching unnaturally behind me. The warmth of the hydro system's wing didn't comfort me now. It felt suffocating, dense with unseen movement, carrying faint whispers through the vents that weren't words but almost sounded like breathing. I quickened my pace, pushing back into the cooler air of the main corridor. Only then did the pressure in my chest begin to ease. But the fear stayed anchored deep inside me. As I crossed into the safer sections of the lab, my tablet buzzed faintly. A new notification appeared. No sender, no timestamp, just a single line. "Come back. You forgot something." My legs nearly buckled. I didn't touch the message, didn't open it. I held my breath as I deleted it immediately, afraid that even reading the preview had given whatever sent it a pathway into my head. The hallway felt colder as I moved forward, like the temperature had dipped a few degrees in response to my refusal. When I reached the junction leading toward the monitoring station, I stopped and listened. Nothing. No misplaced breath. No familiar voices calling. The lab was quiet again. But it wasn't the peaceful silence from hours earlier. This silence felt watchful, like dozens of unseen eyes observed me from the deeper levels. I couldn't shake the realization that Kale's voice hadn't been random, hadn't been chosen arbitrarily. The subjects didn't mimic people you barely knew. They mimicked the ones whose absence would pull you closer, the ones whose memories you couldn't ignore. I steadied myself and forced my mind to stay focused. The rules existed to keep us alive, not comfortable, but alive, and the 10th rule had just proven itself again. If I had answered, even with a whisper, even with a single word, the thing beneath the grates would have known exactly how to climb its way into the upper decks. And once they got a hold on your voice, they didn't let go, not until you followed them down, not until you stopped being you. I swallowed hard and continued forward, knowing I couldn't afford to let any of the rules slip for even a moment, especially not the last one, the most important one, the rule that nobody talked about unless they absolutely had to. And judging from the growing pressure in the air around me, I was about to need it sooner than I wanted. I was nearing the monitoring station when all the corridor lights shifted into a slow, pulsing rhythm, dimming and brightening, as though the entire facility had slipped into a heartbeat pattern. At first, I thought it was another electrical glitch caused by the lower deck's interference, but the tablet in my hand displayed a single flashing alert that froze every thought in my mind. Unscheduled awakening detected. That phrase alone was enough to make my lungs tighten. And then the rule surfaced sharply in my thoughts. Rule 11. If a subject wakes up on its own before the scheduled time, you must seal the lab and leave immediately. Nothing in this place created more fear than an early awakening. Nothing. The scheduled times were monitored down to the second. Subjects didn't simply wake early, not without catastrophic consequences. Their bodies and minds were calibrated to specific phases, and breaking out of those cycles meant they were waking with instincts rather than programming. Instincts shaped by whatever they had become. I swallowed hard and tapped the alert, hoping it was a malfunction, but the screen expanded into a full warning display, showing Pod 3 highlighted in a violent red. Pod 3 wasn't one of the new specimens. It belonged to the older generation, the ones created before the rules existed at all, the ones that taught us why rules were necessary. The hallway around me felt narrower as I moved, as though the reinforced walls were leaning in. I pushed myself to keep walking, forcing my steps to remain slow and even. Panic attracted attention here, and attention was the last thing I could afford. The closer I got to Pod 3's wing, the colder the air became, almost painfully cold, as though the pod was drawing heat from the environment. That had happened once before in the lab's earliest days, right before they shut down the entire floor to contain a breach. We weren't trained for warmth loss. We were warned about it. We were told to run. When I reached the access hallway, the door to the observation chamber sat slightly ajar. My heart hammered, but I didn't step closer. Doors didn't open themselves unless someone had forced them, or unless something inside had moved. A faint, unnatural stillness spread out from the entrance like fog, coating the hall in a dense, suffocating quiet. I reached for the manual override panel on the wall, but the moment my fingers touched the metal, I felt a subtle vibration running through it, not mechanical, rhythmic, as if something inside Pod 3 had begun pacing, tracing its movements through the facility itself. I forced my hand away and stepped back, keeping my eyes fixed on the thin sliver of darkness visible through the slightly open chamber door. My instinct screamed at me not to look inside, not even for a second, because that darkness didn't feel empty. It felt aware, watching, waiting. I could almost sense breath, slow, deliberate, controlled, coming from deeper within the chamber. It wasn't loud, but the presence of it filled the air like cold mist pressing against my skin. I took another step back, but the hall behind me felt too open, too exposed, too vulnerable. Forward or backward, it didn't matter. The threat was already awake. As I recalibrated my breathing, trying to keep my hands from shaking, my tablet chimed with a new notification. I nearly dropped it, thinking it was another warning, but instead a message had appeared on the screen without any sender. "Don't go. It's safer if you stay." My stomach twisted violently. The message pulsed once before vanishing from the display, leaving no trace it had ever existed. The subjects could manipulate visuals in certain wings, but sending messages directly to a device, that meant Pod 3's awakening wasn't just physical, it was cognitive, it was intelligent, it was aware enough to try to delay me. I turned from the chamber door and started down the hall, deciding the only chance I had was reaching the emergency seal controls before the subject fully recognized its surroundings. The rules existed for times like this, when hesitation meant you weren't escaping at all. As I moved, the facility seemed to shift in minute ways, almost like it was trying to guide me or block me. Lights flickered at crossroads, not randomly, but in soft directional pulses. For a moment I wondered whether to trust them, but I had long learned that the lab itself had two moods, protective or predatory, and tonight I couldn't tell which one was watching me. As I approached the main junction, the temperature dropped even more sharply. My breath left faint trails in the air, dissolving too quickly. I could feel movement behind the walls, a subtle displacement of pressure, as though something massive was passing through spaces not meant for it. Something using the ventilation shafts, something that didn't need doors. My pace quickened, not into a run, but into that careful, controlled speed that screams without making noise. The emergency seal station was only 2 hallways away now. If I reached it, I could at least buy myself minutes, maybe seconds, enough to live. Then I heard it, not a voice, not footsteps, something worse. A deep, slow inhalation coming from somewhere behind the walls, like a creature waking up in stages, relearning how to fill its lungs. Every muscle in my body froze. I knew that sound, though I hadn't heard it in years. It was from the archived footage of the earliest generation coming alive. It was the breath they took right before they mimicked the nearest human sound they could find. I pressed my back against the cold wall, choking down a rising surge of panic, knowing that if it chose to mimic my voice, I wouldn't be able to tell if it was me or it. That was the danger. That was the point. The breathing shifted, sliding along the inner ducts, following the path of the ventilation lines toward the higher levels. It was moving faster now, with focus, like it had locked onto a familiar pattern. I pushed myself away from the wall and moved again, forcing my mind to focus on the rule: seal the lab, leave immediately. No checking, no observing, no verifying the environment. Once a subject awakened early, it was no longer a question of containment. It was a question of survival, and the lab hadn't lost a staff member in almost 5 months. It seemed overdue. I rounded the final corner, and relief surged through me when I saw the emergency seal panel at the end of the hall. I reached for it, only for my fingers to stop inches from the controls. A shadow stretched across the floor from the corridor behind me, lengthening with a slow, predatory certainty. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The air behind me vibrated faintly, as though something was shifting its weight, adjusting to the shape of the hall. My heartbeat pounded painfully, loud enough that I wondered if the subject could hear it through the cold air. I inhaled and forced myself to choose survival over curiosity. With a trembling hand, I activated the seal sequence. The alarm didn't blare. It simply triggered a deep locking mechanism that echoed through the structure. Doors began sliding shut one by one in the distance. The shadow behind me tightened, contracting sharply before slipping back out of view, as if the thing had sensed the seal coming. The air warmed slightly, but only enough to tell me it was moving away, into passages I couldn't see, into parts of the lab that weren't covered by human sensors. The final metal barrier locked into place between me and Pod 3's wing. But even as I stood there, breathing hard, I knew the seal wasn't enough. Early awakenings didn't just escape containment. They changed the facility around them. And now one was awake, a fully autonomous subject with intelligence, memory, and a new awareness of everyone still inside this structure. I took one final breath and stepped into the escape elevator, feeling the walls tremble faintly as the lab settled into a new, unnatural quiet. The darkness behind the sealed doors didn't feel empty. It felt patient, waiting for the next time someone forgot a rule, waiting for the next opening, waiting for the next name to call. And I knew, with a cold certainty that tightened in my chest, that it hadn't woken alone. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.